Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our latest webinar, the final steps to November 1. I'm sure there's a lot of people eagerly awaiting the deadline with lots of questions. We have a fantastic panel today, so very excited to get this one underway and share lots of knowledge with everyone and obviously answer lots of questions as well. So first up, we would just like to acknowledgement of country. We welcome and acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. As we break down our agenda today, I'm Ben, your host today, welcoming you to this great webinar we've got planned. We'll then be working our way through our survey findings. So thank you to everyone who answered some questions as they registered today, and we'll take you through those, some interesting information that came out of that. Then Tyler, our data scientist, will be coming through and highlighting a few bits of key data for us today as well. Then we'll be moving on to our panel. We have a fantastic panel, which I'll update you on in a second. Then we're going to have a bit of a poll before we move on to lots of Q&A, hopefully, at the end, before we then wrap it up, hopefully right on time today at 1 o'clock. So just a reminder, ask questions. The chat is open, the chat is monitored. We'll try and get to as many questions as we can today, but I'm sure there are a lot of questions. I'm sure many of you were in the Department and Commission's webinar yesterday, where there were probably hundreds of questions coming through in the chat. So I'm sure we'll have a few too. So we'll try and get to as many as we can. And if there are others that we can't, we might post some blog posts and some other information out to the industry to support you with some of those questions that you may have where we can answer them. This event qualifies for 1 CPD point, so please add that to your log if you need to register that as part of your program. So first up with our survey questions. So the first one that we asked at the start of the registration, do you believe the new Aged Care Act and strengthened standards will deliver meaningful improvements for older Australians? So pretty significant amount here, 70% think that it will deliver some, but there also will be some gaps remaining. 18% though said yes, they see that there'll be significant improvements with the new Act and strengthened standards. 10% minimal, unlikely to change much, and 2% no, they think the risks may outweigh the benefits. So a few people still unsure, but overwhelmingly, some people think that that will be a good improvement, but there may be some gaps still remaining as well. Next was, what areas are most at risk of unintended negative consequences from 1 November? Fairly even split here. Obviously, 28%, the most, was around governance and compliance burden. Then we've got 24% with financial stability, 23% workforce dissatisfaction and burnout, 16% on clinical care and care minutes, and 10% on consumer choice and expectations. So pretty significant, I guess, the three key ones there around governance and compliance burden, financial stability, and workforce dissatisfaction and burnout are some of those maybe unintended risks or negative consequences from the upcoming changes. Next up was, if you were to choose only one area, which has been the most challenging to prepare for? And again, regulatory compliance and readiness, obviously probably to be expected with a significant amount of 31%. Followed by operational implementation at 25%, 23% for workforce readiness, 13% for financial preparedness, and 7% for governance and leadership. So yeah, interesting. That was only one you could choose from there, but clearly regulatory compliance and making sure that everyone's on top of things has been the most challenging so far. Next up was, how prepared are you for the commencement of the new Act and standards? And again, pretty evenly split here, as you can see from our chart there. 48% believe they are well prepared with minor gaps, which is great to see. Where 44% are moderately prepared, have still got some significant work required. So pretty even split there. And then we've got 4% with limited preparation and have got high concern around that. 3%, which is great to see, fully prepared and confident. So there's a good portion there of homes that are very confident, which is nice to see. And 1% though are unprepared and highly concerned. So that is also concerning, but obviously looking at the numbers there, most people are well prepared or moderately prepared, which is great as they work their way towards that 1 November deadline. And then, do you believe the government and regulators are ready to support providers through the 1 November changes? 64%, so pretty strong somewhat. It's patchy or unclear. Now, hopefully from yesterday's webinar, that if we did the poll again today, that number may have changed with a bit of clarification yesterday and then highlighting their approach to the upcoming changes. 25% though says no, the support has been inadequate. I'm assuming probably lack of information and probably just the delay of some of the information that's coming out. 5% yes, believe though there has been strong support in place, and 6% are unsure on their thoughts on that one specifically. So I'm now going to pass it over to Tyler, our data scientist, who's going to take us through some stats that he's prepared and a bit of information as well as we head towards 1 November.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, interesting poll results there. And I think the one that really jumped out at me was, do you believe the new Act and strengthened standards will deliver meaningful improvements for older Australians, where 70% said some, but gaps will remain. And I guess I mean that's a huge majority for these poll questions, which we see usually a bit more distribution. But would love to hear what people think are some of those gaps that will remain. I certainly have my own ideas, but I'd also really be interested to know what people think with regards to how the industry as a whole sort of closes those gaps, where I guess what I'm thinking is, there is a limitation to what legislation is able to do, and so what other mechanisms are there for an industry to sort of make strides forward to close these gaps? And I guess the other thing that kind of led me into thinking was sort of the language that the government used around initiating this act, where obviously it was something they wanted to have very person-centered and rights-based, something that afforded more choice to the consumer. And then even using additional language like dignity, safer, more consistent care. So those are I guess really really good goals to have, and where that led me was just sort of looking at the resident experience surveys over the past few years, and that has been improving. So even prior to this act taking effect, and I guess with these higher bars to meet, almost all of them have a direct, if not indirect, burden of cost. And like anything, that cost is getting passed through to the consumer. And so what I'm showing here is the average advertised room price month on month for this year, which is something we've been looking at regularly as the maximum RAD price without prior approval, increased from January 1 this year. So we have seen huge proportion of services take that opportunity to put up pricing. So we're tracking the number of services that have done that month on month, and then here just the average price. But I would say, almost three-quarters of services in the industry have increased their pricing to some extent at some time this year, if not multiple times this year. And I guess the question there, is with these higher goals and higher sort of delivery of care, higher services, and more choice. The additional cost for that is that leading to an improved experience. And I guess that what time will tell following the initiation of the act. But the resident experience survey for the past few years has certainly showed steps forward. And what I'll sort of delve into on the next slide is where we're seeing that improvement in that experience, where you can see here a lot of that survey result improvement is coming out of these three questions. Do you feel at home here? So obviously a really important one in terms of the overall experience for a consumer. So in the past 3 years, going from always at 40%, do you feel home here, up to 60%. So that's a huge jump. Um, do you have a say in your daily activities? Another one where, we're seeing a 20% increase in people responding always, from 50 up to just under 70. And I do think there is a bit of a theoretical maximum in the responses of these questions. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But the third question here, are you encouraged to do as much as possible for yourself? So um, going back to 2023, under 50% of respondents saying that they were always encouraged, and that's gone up 10% to just under 60%. But yeah, you can see how sort of each of the responses has fluctuated over those past three survey years. And then moving on to the next slide, where we see potentially room for improvement, and where we haven't seen really any change, is these three questions. Are staff kind and caring? And do staff treat you with respect? Where that may seem unfortunate that those haven't improved more. But really, these are some of the most highly favorable responded questions in the entire survey. So our staff kind and caring, sort of consistently at 65, 66% of people saying always. And do staff treat you with respect, where it, you know, shows that always has fallen off a little bit from that 70% down to, yeah, maybe 68%. But again, I see this more as a limitation of the survey itself, and not necessarily a reflection of the sector, where I think when survey respondents are posed these questions, you're always going to have people that have a very literal approach to saying always versus most of the time, and that there is going to be this theoretical maximum score that you can expect out of this type of survey, and the responses available for the questions, and really the nature of the questions themselves. So again, where we did see that really im improving trend, were those questions where there was sort of a gap to build up to that 70% line. And then here, the odd question out: do you like the food here? So consistently the lowest um, responded question, year in, year out, and one that's really hard to improve on, but certainly one that has the room for most improvement. And I guess going back to my opening remarks, where we've had a lot of attention uh, put towards food and nutrition, and going back to that our survey question, where 70% of people said yes, there will be improvements, but gaps will remain. Where I see this food question as an area where we have had a lot of increased attention and resources pushed into this area. And have we realized any significant improvement, or is there still a gap? Which sort of goes back to my question around, what is the role of the act? What is the role of legislation in terms of governing, and where what other mechanisms might exist for organizations or for peak bodies to guide or close gaps in regards to where legislation potentially has fallen short or just doesn't have the authority to really affect the change that's required. So I think that hopefully is a good segue to our panel, because we have a really great panel lined up that can hopefully speak a bit more around what those mechanisms are and what organizations have at their disposal to meet these challenges.
Cool. Thanks, Tyler. I think you're spot on there, especially with the food. So I watch this space to see the 2026 results with a whole standard dedicated now to food and nutrition. So it'll be interesting to see if some of those always bump up a little bit with a heavy focus now with the commission and a whole new standard focused and dedicated to that with the new strengthened standards from 1 November.
Yeah, well, and the room pricing as well. So I think with the act now in effect, a lot of attention is going to shift to accommodation structure and room pricing. So there's the ongoing or just sort of started consultation into accommodation pricing, and I'll be involved with that to a little bit as they're gathering information. But I think there will be a lot to say in that space over the coming months, and really a top-down review from the accommodation supplement to the concessional ratio, the function of RADs versus DAPs. I think all of that is coming into question. So I think there will be a lot to say in that space as well.
Yep. Maybe a topic for another webinar.
Yeah.
And as Tyler mentioned, we've got a fantastic panel today, so really excited. Some people with some great experience and expertise to help us talk through some of these things and the plans for 1 November. So first up, we've got Rachel Pandelli today, Chairperson and Director of Clinical Governance at Amman Aged Care Services. We've got Anita Courtney, Aged Care and Home Care Principal at Russell Kennedy Lawyers, and Susan Staples, Principal at Staples Advisory, all taking us through different sections. So I'm going to throw now across to Rachel. Welcome, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts on how homes can be prepared and what they need to be looking at and keeping their eye on as we fast approach 1 November.
Thank you, Ben. So there are some key changes, and what are the aims of those key changes? So the aims of the key changes for the complaints handling are fair and timely and learning focused complaint resolution that restores rights. So that's the aim. So what are some of the key changes that we have in there? So we need to have a clear complaints pathway, pathways linked to rights of the consumer or the resident, options to escalate to the complaints commissioner. We need to know about the timely acknowledgement of the complaints when they're coming in and how we triage those as an organisation. And what is the outcome tracking from those complaints, and what is that trend analysis? So there's a lot of emphasis on trending, and do we see themes in that trending? So the stronger obligations that are required with the complaints process is the learnings from it, demonstrate the learnings, the remediation processes, and the impact to the people that we serve in our organisations. So I think that's one of the key changes, and impact is very important. What are some of these practical strategies? We can have policies for complaints, and that's great, but what we need to do is publish a transparent document on how to complain, whether that's internally or externally, and how those processes work. A triage matrix you can use in your complaint system. We certainly do use a risk matrix, identifying the urgency of some of these complaints and how they're grouped and the timely responses that we're going to have to them, and the high-level escalations that we have in complaints and how they escalated to the board and how are they monitored. So that's really important, and getting that consumer feedback again on how to complain. the quarterly thematic reviews for the governance oversight, these need to be reported into the board and the quality committee. This way, the board has complete oversight, as does the executive management team and quality committee and even staff, about what types of themes are we getting through with our complaints. Does it need extra education? Does it need a remediation externally? Do we have advocacy services that are out there to support people in the complaints process? Are we practicing open disclosure? All of these things in the complaints handling process are practical strategies on what we need to do. The most important thing is to make sure that we're feeding them in as an organisation into our risk register. So that, for me, is what I see as the key takeaways and the practical strategies on complaints handling within the organisation's internal and external oversight. When we're looking at clinical governance, what's new again with the clinical governance? We're aiming at the board level oversight again that drives the continuous safety and quality improvement. So how do we do that? We do that with board reporting, subcommittees of the board, such as the clinical governance committee. What are the key indicators that we are needing to collect? Are we seeing, again, thematic, things coming through? Is it an increase in falls? Have we trended the increase in falls? Can we see what is actually happening down on the ground? How is that feeding in? So one of the things that we can do with the clinical governance is to make sure that we have a really robust clinical governance framework, make sure that all our committee members that are on the clinical governance committee understand their roles and responsibilities and what that trended analysis actually looks like, especially in relation to incident reviews, restrictive practice. What is the oversight and escalation? How is that feeding into our risk registers? Some of our risk mitigation strategies are as easy as clinical assessments, making sure all our clinical assessments done, or where there's a change in a client's condition, whether that's home care or inside of a residential aged care service. Is our care planning up to date? Does it demonstrate clinical risk that we may have? Is there a dignity of risk being signed by our clients? And education of the staff, and even education of the clients and their families. So having a really robust clinical governance framework is probably one of the first practical strategies, and making sure that's approved with KPIs and dashboards for our high impact, high prevalence, pressure injuries, medication management, infections, and include our emerging risk scores. So we can actually capture if someone is moving to high risk or high impact, high prevalence. And also having vulnerable consumers on that high impact, high prevalence register as well. Making sure that our staff are well trained and well educated, and an annual plan for auditing our care plans and assessment schedules and case conference schedules. That's very, very important. And if there is a significant event such as morbidity or mortality, a review should be done to include staff debriefing, significant other debriefings, and support to the people involved, because there is impact in anything that we do when there's a significant event. So there are some practical strategies for clinical governance. There's a question in the chat as well that I'll get to. So food and nutrition for residential, not home care. What's new in integrated risk controls? So what is the outcome for food and nutrition? Is more dignified meal times that demonstrate upholding the rights of our consumers or the people that we serve. What are the key changes? We have now dedicated food and nutrition standard, which is the first time it's been done. So centering on choice, dignity, and mealtime experience, which also we would look through clinical governance with clinical assessments for dysphagia, for choking hazards in the high impact, high prevalence area. So they do correlate, and weight loss. Menu planning with individual preferences for textured modified diets, having our dietitians look at the menus with our dining focus groups. If we have dining focus groups, how often are they held? Are we looking at our complaints and feedback systems, our surveys? If there are issues with food, what is the closed loop that we have, and what are the outcomes that we can evaluate? So we also have stronger governance on kitchen operations and food safety. And again, it's that consumer engagement and them being involved in that decision-making, because it is their home, and food is a big part, especially in our culturally and linguistically diverse homes. It centers all around food. So it's really, really important. To risk mitigate some of the issues that we might have in the food and nutrition standard, we can have person-centered menus as much as possible, as much as the kitchen also too, and catering can allow for that as well. Protected meal times and assistance with meal plans, ensuring dietary assessments and referral to other allied health professionals if there's issues with food and nutrition. Compliance in our textured modified diets and training, our choking risk reviews, and our dignity of risk for our consumers that would like to take a supported decision-making risk, and increasing our hydration rounds as well. There's simple, practical strategies that we can use. But more often than not, our dietitian reviews that are based with all our allied health reviews, which is part of clinical governance, that's really important, is getting that foundation right. Having consumer tasting panels with each seasonal menu change, and monthly waste and complaint trend analysis that should be collected as part of your normal indicators. Reporting on food and nutrition KPIs to the board is very important. The board needs to have oversight on what's happening with food and nutrition with their consumers, with catering operations, and with clinical governance. And we can link these findings also to the statement of rights and principles.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rachel. Pretty much all of those three key topics, I guess, cover a lot around workforce. How have you, just a quick question, how have you managed the knowledge sharing and the training and education of staff on these types of topics that they need to be aware of around complaint handling, clinical implications, food and nutrition, the catering team, and so on?
We use multiple learning platforms. So we use Alice, we use other learning platforms as well. Plus we use face-to-face training. Our dietitians and catering staff are trained on site. Even if they're outsourced, part of our compliance and contractor management is to have them trained also not on their systems, but also on ours, on what this looks like. The identification, also through apps that we have online diet ordering as well.
Yep.
And having allied health services also to conduct dysphagia training, choking hazard training, first aid, things like that, and making sure people understand this is all documented in the care plans.
Yep. And how have staff generally, from your experience so far, taken to the change? Because change is always hard with everyone.
Yeah, change is always hard. Change management takes time, Ben, as you know.
Yes.
Look, the staff are very receptive. The staff that we have at Amand Care, our frontline staff are very well educated. They've been in industry for quite a long time before coming to us as well. And it's just a new, fresh approach in the training and showing them, you know, the theoretical component and how it's managed in a practical sense.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for that. We will keep moving on, conscious of time. So next up, we now have Anita Courtney from Russell Kinney Lawyers, who's going to take us through some other bits of information as we prepare for 1 November. Anita, I'll pass it across to you.
Great. Just next slide, please. Next slide again, thanks. So look, I thought it was a good chance to just touch base about the resident agreements. We're getting a lot of these sort of last minute changes now that the resident agreement's done and out there. And we're still getting quite a lot of questions about grandfathering. So I thought I would sort of start by talking about what the grandfathering rules are, which agreements and so forth. So you're clear about which agreement you should use for residents from 1 November. So anyone who is approved for care after 12 September 2024 is going to be a new on the new agreement unless they entered permanent care prior to 1 November. So I do stress it's permanent care. Being in respite care prior to 1 November is going to be irrelevant for them. Those who entered care prior to 1 November and decide to move homes, they will be fully grandfathered. So they're grandfathered for their care fees, they're grandfathered for their accommodation payments. And then the third category, this is this partially grandfathered group. So these are anyone who was approved for home care pre-12 September, but they enter the care facility on an ongoing basis post 1 November. So someone could be on respite now, perhaps they've got a approval that was from prior to 12 September, so they're going to fall in that category. But basically it's that 12 September date that's going to be really critical if someone isn't already in residential aged care. So just go to the next slide, please. Okay, so Which fees that will they pay? So what does this grandfathering really mean? So basically, anyone who's fully grandfathered is going to pay the current fee, so the means tested care fee with the lifetime cap of whatever it is now, 80,000 or so, plus they'll pay accommodation payments without retentions or indexation. So this is probably, the second one's probably the trickier category. So these are the people who were approved for or receiving care prior to 12 September. So they pay the current care fees, but they're going to pay the new accommodation fees. So that's why we talk about them being partially grandfathered. They're grandfathered for care, but not accommodation, which if you think about it makes sense. So residents who then were approved for permanent care who did not enter care prior to November, unless they had that home care approval from 12 September 2024, the fact they were approved for care is irrelevant. So they'll just be in that first category. Again, they're going to pay all the new arrangements. And likewise, as I said, with respite care, the fact that someone's in respite care today is irrelevant unless they've got that 12 September approval for home care. Next slide, please. So in terms of then which agreements, so basically anyone admitted after 1 November who's completely new to the system, makes sense they're on a new ASA is what we're calling it. That's the new term for resident agreement. It stands for accommodation and service agreement. So residents who are currently in your care, you don't need to worry about giving them a new agreement. I'm sure you're all aware of that by now, unlike poor support at home. But yeah, no need to worry about them. But there is certain information you should make sure you've given all your existing residents, which I'll take you through as well. So as I mentioned, residents who come to you from another facility, if they were in prior to 1 November and they move across after the 1st of November to you, they will be grandfathered fully. So they're going to need their own agreement. We're calling this a transfer agreement for residents who entered prior to 1 November. And then the residents who had that home care approval as at the transition date of 12 September 2024, they are going to actually go on to the new ASA. There's just a slight difference there in terms of how you complete their care fees section. So rather than completing that they'll pay a hotelling contribution and a non-clinical care contribution, you just complete that they'll pay a means tested care fee. But otherwise the agreement is fine to use for those residents. And we thought it was better to have them in the one agreement rather than try and have all these different agreements. Next slide, please. So I know this slide looks like a bit of a mess. I do apologise. I'm not great with tech. But look, I wanted to show you a couple of the new parts of the agreement because these are, again, things we're getting questions about. So firstly, this room services concept. Under the legislation, you have to set out any services that the payment of the accommodation payment entitles the resident to. So we sort of loosely term these room services, and it's all dealt with in the definition. But basically, what you should be putting here is if you advertise services as part of your My Aged Care descriptor and perhaps it was part of your pricing approval, you should be mentioning those in here. Now, don't panic if you're not sure. I'm sure there are plenty of pricing approval forms out there that no one's picked up in years. So what we've suggested a kind of generic statement you could use to make that clear. The reason we wouldn't put NA or none, unless you're sure, if there's no services, that's fine. But if you put NA or none, you just need to be wary that you might then have a misleading statement on the My Aged Care website if you have advertised services as part of the room price. So just be aware of that. You're probably better to go with this, any services included with the room outlined by us in connection with the published accommodation payment amount. That is the way we would suggest you deal with it there. The next one I wanted to draw your attention to is this concept. Oh, actually, Ben, if you wouldn't mind going back, that would be great. Just the concept of the start day. Basically, you have to do an annual review, as you probably know, of the agreement. Just be aware you have to put in a date for that annual review to occur by or on. So we've just put in a section there for you to insert the date. Unfortunately, you can't just say within 12 months. You have to actually put a date, not only for the start date, but then also for the review date. And then the final thing just on this part is the relevant policies and protocols, we're getting a lot of questions about this. This is actually its own part in the agreement. Under the legislation, this is now a requirement that you give people relevant policies and protocols relevant to them living at the home. Now, it's a little unclear as to how broad this is. Does it mean every clinical policy, every policy around, how you manage private information and so forth? We think no. We think it's much more confined to really the sort of stuff you would put in your handbook. So, for example, how can the resident, what are the visiting hours? How can they book an appointment through you? Who do they speak to about if they have a concern about the food? Those sorts of things, the kind of things you would ordinarily put in your handbook. Next slide. Don't want to say too much about this one, except that this is for capturing the supporter details. This is in the legislation. You have to do this. What you'll just note there is that we've enabled you to specify whether that supporter is someone who's allowed to receive information, because just because somebody is registered as a supporter doesn't mean they're automatically entitled to information. It's only if the resident consents to that. So we've enabled you to say yes or no to them receiving information. Next slide. Okay, so then just moving slightly away from the agreements, but also very relevant, the information you need to give to new RAC residents. So you need to make sure that A, this is in your agreement, or B, if it's not, that it's somewhere, perhaps it's in your handbook, which you then give them with the agreement. So a lot of it's pretty stuff we're used to. You have to give them the statement of rights. No, it doesn't need to be signed anymore, which is good, but you do need to give it to them. You need to give them a copy of the code of conduct. You need to also give them a copy of your complaints and feedback policy and your whistleblower policy. So this is the documents that you now need to have under those sections of the new Act, and it's a fair bit more prescriptive than what it used to be. The Act talks about you having a system and a policy, which I'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide, but just be aware that you do need to give them your policy. Then there's a whole lot of things, these next 4 dot points. The point I'll just make about that is we've covered those in the agreement. So, and that's the case with most of these things, other than obviously your complaints and feedback policy and whistleblower policy. But as much as possible, we've covered everything in the agreement, so you don't really need to worry about giving it to them separately. So if you're using a standard Russell Kennedy agreement, then that information will be in there, but it's all and stuff we're used to. Next slide. Existing residents. So really the things I think you need to give to them are going to be your statement of rights, your new complaints and feedback policy, and of course your new whistleblower policy. Next slide. Okay, so whistleblower and complaints. Sorry, I'm not sure why that heading's been left in. That's me working on these too late last night. So basically, the thing I want to make the point about here is really distinguishing between you having a detailed whistleblower system and a complaints and feedback system versus what you need to give to residents. So under the Act, there's now much more prescriptive requirements about what needs to go into your complaints and feedback policy and what needs to go into your whistleblower policy. And in addition, you then need to have a policy that you give to consumers, to supporters, to their to your responsible persons and to your aged care workers. And you must remind those people monthly or regularly, but at least monthly, about their right to make a whistleblower disclosure or to raise a complaint. So we've got templates for these, and just to give you an idea, our system, the sort of more detailed internal document, which is going to be the one that complies with all the provisions in the Act, it's around 10 to 12 pages per policy, so 1 complaints and feedback, 1 whistleblower. Some people combine them. The actual policy you give to clients is more like 2 pages, so it can be a lot shorter. And then the only other thing I'll say about these is that you do need to do annual training on these policies and an annual review of the policy. So what I would be suggesting is you would reissue the full policy, the 2-pager one, to your staff, residents, etc. annually. Next slide. I think that was it. So just one other thing, record keeping requirements. So just to make the point that particularly if you are in a state other than Victoria, New South Wales or the ACT, be aware that you now have longer record keeping retention periods. So it's now gone from 3 up to 7 years. That will be it's different in the states I mentioned, just because they have longer periods. You have to be 7 years post discharge of the resident. So just make sure you're aware of what periods apply to the records you're holding about residents. Don't retain information for longer than is required, purely from it's unlawful under the Privacy Act to do so, and you also, of course, increase the risk of a data breach the longer you're holding on to what is incredibly sensitive personal information about people. And finally, you should have policies for dealing with requests to access for information by residents, supporters, noting they're not entitled to access automatically, and obviously other representatives and families.
Fantastic. That's a lot to take in, a lot to plan for. There was a quick question on that, Anita. Does Russell County currently have any other languages available with the policies and things and the agreements?
No, we don't sort of do the translation part of it. We have clients who will get them translated. I understand the department is doing some translations. I don't know if anyone's had any experience with that. I'd be interested to hear, but no, we don't, just because it's obviously very difficult for us to be confident that it's being correctly translated. So some providers will translate it themselves.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you for that. And one quick one, when we were going through the changes, there is also, when you transfer from home, correct me if I'm wrong, you can also choose to opt in. Is there an opt-in policy as well if you want to transition to the new framework?
Great question. And yes, you can choose to transfer in. I'm trying to think if you have to be out of care for 28 days. I don't believe so. I think you can opt in. Yeah, good. But yes, no policy as such yet. It's not quite like the continuing care recipient one was under the old Act. I suspect they will sort of look for they'll develop some sort of opt-in form, the department, but I haven't seen one yet.
Okay, thank you. It feels like we're just going back in time again, back to when we had lump sum bonds and RADs and DAPs and the transfers and retentions and transferring the retentions from one home to another to the count. And yeah, it's just bringing back a lot of memories to just, what was old is new again.
Yes.
And obviously your contact details as well. So if anyone would like to reach out to Anita or is interested in policies or agreements, please scan the barcode. You get access to some information there. Next up, we have governance and risks, and Susan Sable's joining us now as well to take us through some key areas. Susan, I'll pass across to you.
Thank you, Ben. So I'm going to take a slightly different tack in terms of less detail and almost stepping back, because a lot of the governance discussion and some of the risk obligations are really more of an organisation and system level. And I know that actually some of the governance requirements and obligations have already come into play. So things like the quality advisory bodies, the consumer bodies, the need to have independent directors, etc., they're already in play. I think now it's about how do you demonstrate that these are working and that these are in place. And essentially, if we go back to the sort of the fundamentals of the Royal Commission and what it was trying to do from a governance uplift perspective was to really strengthen the oversight and strengthen the risk-based decision-making and making sure that that is putting people at the centre. So for those of you who have been part of the Governing for Reform program, there was a whole program around uplift of governance, and it was very much around those shifts. I think critically the core obligations, and some of them are up there, to really embed accountability and to uplift the capability from an oversight perspective at the provider level. And there's a couple of areas where that's really being called out, and we're seeing a lot of that through the strengthened requirements of the Act and the rules themselves. I think, again, I'll just quickly touch on those in a minute, but one of the things that, as I said, I think it's keen to now demonstrate in the lead up to 1 November is that a lot of these things will be in place. We've had some new systems. We've seen all of the new requirements that Rachel and Anita have spoken to, in part, and obviously across many of the other changes. But it's now about what have we done what do we need to continue to do and how have we implemented it and where are our risks? And so that continuous improvement perspective. So from a governance perspective, it's making sure that we've got all of those systems in place and that the oversight mechanisms are there. I think if we look at I guess the key obligations I've listed here, the statutory duty around a registered provider and a responsible person, yes, they'll be coming into effect as of 1 November. And I think, that really does enshrine that registered providers must ensure that they operate on a no harm basis and that they have the older person at the centre of all of their decision making. And it's the responsible person's statutory duty to make sure that that requirement or that obligation is upheld. So a responsible person needs to know they're a responsible person, and that's a director or a senior executive, but also it needs to understand the systems and the frameworks and the protocols and processes that are in place to ensure that the registered provider is providing safe care. And that does come down to a suitability test, which sits in the Act, and that's sort of around being fit and proper and having the right skills and in some instances the right level of independence. Within that, then you've got your governance systems and transparency. We've got independent board members, how you're managing conflict of interest. And I think that's a really critical one as well. And I think also the notification and reporting. So now when changes to the registered provider or the responsible person are made, they need to be notified to the Commission. So it's about having the processes in place and the induction processes in place so that people know that that's a requirement and that those things are happening at the right time. When we get down to the quality and risk systems, again, if we go back to that registered provider duty around no harm, and that all of the decisions must be risk-based and informed and minimising risk to older Australians, there really does need to be a strong focus on understanding the risks that are existing in your organisation, and understanding how they're monitored, what's being done about it, and is that management action or that control effective. My experience within working with a lot of aged care providers and I guess human services more generally is that there's often a disconnect between quality and risk. We confuse quality and risk. I think quality risk is absolutely an important part of the organisation, but there's enterprise risk as well. And some organisations have blind spots when it comes to things that are outside quality risk. And I think that's a really core maturity aspect for many boards going into this new system. But one of the key things that is an obligation is from a quality perspective is making sure, and Rachel spoke to this earlier, that you've got the incident management policies, the feedback mechanisms, the continuous improvement processes, and being able to demonstrate that that's in place and that they are working effectively. It's similar for the financial and prudential oversight. There's a lot more accountability and reporting required around your financial liquidity, solvency, making sure you've got audited reports. I think there's annual, interim and on-demand reports potentially around financial position. And a lot of this will inform that risk-based regulatory model that the Commission is taking. So if they see risks in certain areas, it can create, or if they see issues or potential issues, then that would inform their risk-based approach to kind of oversight and audits. I think the digital and data governance piece is very much around making sure you've got accurate systems that are transparent and that you can report when you need to report, and that there are no, there are a lot of tests in place and accuracy checks to make sure that the information that you're providing, but also that you're receiving, is timely and it's accurate. And again, from a governance perspective, it's making sure that the systems are in place to be able to check that and get that level of assurance that these are working. The last area is around oversight of third-party and contracted providers. So that includes your associated providers. And I think making sure that, going back to that duty and that no harm to older Australians, the registered provider duty, there needs to be oversight of the services that are being provided by contracted and subcontracted or associated providers, because you're ultimately responsible for the the care that they are providing to your consumers. So it's one of the more tricky ones because it's sort of out of your control in terms of some of the things that you might be able to do, but that's where the contracts that you have in place need to be very clear about auditing rights, monitoring rights, and the ability for you to be able to test whether those providers or those subcontractors are actually meeting your requirements and meeting your expectations of what good care looks like and how any risks are being managed. Thanks, Ben. I wanted to try and give a bit of a bit of a practical sense of some of the final governance and risk checks with only 10 days to go. Thinking about, what are some of the things that you can do just in the final days so that when you get to the 1st of November, and I know there'll be many organisations who won't be 100% ready, and anyone who joined the Commission's webinar yesterday will know that the Commission itself is not expecting everyone to be 100% ready. But what can we do to sort of understand where we are, where our gaps are? So I'd say one of the first things that would be helpful to do is to look at your statutory duties, make sure that everyone understands the registered provider status that they have and the responsible person duties that they might be assigned, or there's an accountability map that's ready. And importantly, that those people have been inducted and trained and are aware of those responsibilities. And I think, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, it's about demonstrating that you've got these things in place. And so have you got evidence that those protocols have been updated for notifications? Have you got evidence that there is, this training has been done and that you've got all of the renewal processes for board members, etc. So it's really being able to evidence that and having that documented in your policies. I think that leads into the second piece, which is about finalising and endorsing any of those remaining charters. So a lot of the work that we talked about in terms of board's obligations, what the board needs to have oversight of, what management need to be looking at, what a responsible person is, and we talked about whistleblower policies and we talked about complaints policies. They need to be in place. Do a final review. Make sure you've got them. Make sure they're ready to go and they've been signed off and endorsed. I think importantly, test the data integrity. I know there's a lot of work going on with Services Australia, and there's a lot of information that was provided in the webinar yesterday by the Commission where Services Australia were on the call. There are some shutdown periods, so be aware of those, but also just making sure that your end and your data has had some level of data integrity check and a sign off internally, and that you actually have access to the portal and that the portal has the right information about your registration, etc. Going back to the risk and quality component, I think, as I mentioned, there's often a disconnect between quality and risk management. So quality risk and enterprise risk. Try and make sure they're aligned. And if you need help with your enterprise risk framework, because I think a lot of organisations have fabulous quality and clinical governance frameworks, but what about the enterprise risks and those broader risks? Often there's a lot of great work that gets done at the operational level, but the board and what the board are looking at can be quite different. And so there's a bit of a risk maturity piece in there and a connection piece to make sure that those two pieces of the puzzle are working together. Number 5 is going back to, from a compliance perspective, really making sure that your worker screening's been done and that's all completed and signed off, and that everyone has been trained on the statement of rights and the code of conduct. Again, from an evidence perspective and an oversight perspective at the governance level, keep records of that and make sure you can evidence that when the Commission comes and asks, has everyone been trained? Yes, we've got it in the system, or yes, we've had people sign that off. And the board has seen evidence of that, I think, is really important. As Anita was talking through before, that final review of the service agreements and sort of third-party contracts, really important just to make sure that you're comfortable with all of those before day one. Verifying your financial and prudential position. So there's been a lot of changes. There's a lot of new requirements around investment strategies, liquidity ratios, understanding what you might need to report on that's different. And that actually goes across all of the different areas that we've talked about, whether it's complaints, whether it's consumer feedback, whether it's incidents, whether it's risk, financial data, all of that stuff. We might need to think about what we report at executive and board level. And some of that reporting might need to change because we're we could be measuring things slightly differently in terms of what good looks like. And financial, I think, would be a really good one, a good example of that. When we get to number 8, we're looking at the consumers. So, you know, it's so important to keep consumers engaged and getting their feedback, making sure that communication is there. So a final check that we've sent out the final comms, that people are clear about what might be happening or what is still to be determined, but just that constant communication and making sure that any final comms can be done in the last 10 days. And the last 2 steps, I think, are really, really important, particularly from an evidence-based perspective, and particularly if we're looking at the regulatory model, where the Commission again yesterday said, as long as there is a genuine effort to identify where you're not getting it right, and that you have an action plan to address anything that is still outstanding, that is essentially, I think, the regulatory approach for the first few months, as it was described yesterday by Liz. So what I would recommend is prepare a readiness gap assessment, like a bit of a gap analysis across key areas, and where there might be sort of key residual risk exposures. So things that could have a high likelihood of going wrong or a big impact if they do, and get that in front of the board and make sure they're across that, and that everyone is signed off on what those key risk areas or gaps are. And importantly, what are the actions that are being taken to address them, to bring them back to an acceptable level as quickly as possible? And that actually talks about having ownership and accountability assigned, and times and dates assigned to getting that done. And just do red, amber, green reporting, like keep it simple, make sure that it's clear what needs to be done, and to reduce any of the gaps between now and 100% ready. The last piece is the review. So continuous improvement. So what's the 30-day plan look like in terms of being able to come back and check in on where we are and keep ourselves accountable? Thanks, Ben. I guess just wanted to call out a couple of things. Again, this is from an oversight perspective. So if we're wanting to make sure that the organisation is ready, that we're providing good care, what are some of the things that we just want to keep an eye on? Whether you're a senior executive, whether you're in operations, or whether you're on the board. Are staff understanding the changes? Is there still confusion? Do we need to address anything around the confidence that the staff have in I guess, implementing and talking about these changes with older people? Have we got any system or portal issues, any tech issues that we need to kind of address? When it talks here about regular testing in the early stages, that's also around your processes. So it's not necessarily about your systems or your tech systems, because that's covered off above. But are the processes and the protocols that we've had to implement, are they working? Is there anything that's kind of not quite right or is feeling a bit clunky? And what feedback are we getting to be able to kind of validate that or identify where those issues are? Obviously, we want to keep on top of any non-conformances or near misses, and those continuous improvement actions and how we're addressing those. I think they're really key to keep top of mind, and for senior leaders and governing bodies to kind of keep on top of. The last thing, Ben, if you could just flick the slide across, just, I guess, a bit of advice or a bit of, there's a lot going on. So how can you kind of just stay focused on what matters? As I said yesterday, the message from the Commission was the genuine effort is required. So keep evidence to be able to demonstrate what you're doing and the actions that you're taking and the gaps that you've got. Evidence could be, work that you've done. It could be board meeting minutes where things are getting put up to board for sign off. Just keep as much evidence as you can. The other thing is, and I saw this a lot through COVID, when there's uncertainty, and this is definitely a time of uncertainty. I'm sorry, I just saw the time. That can create tension, and that's often when board and executives can kind of get into a bit of a lockhead or headlock agreement, and it can create a bit of tension. So sorry, Ben, I've just gone well over, but I'll.
No, don't apologise.
Yeah.
It's all really important information. I'm sure everyone that's paying attention. I've seen some of the questions and comments there. Very much appreciate your checklist as well.
I will just call out reporting, because that's a really important one. So try to keep it simple and try to focus on, you're telling me something, why are you telling us this, and what are we doing? It makes it really action oriented and really insightful. So that's probably the only other one. I'd call out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Susan. That was very much appreciated, I believe, for a lot of people that will be watching. And where do you, just a quick one on the board side of things, I'm always interested in this aspect. If we were to poll the board members, how well do you think they're prepared for 1 November?
Oh, it's a bit like the self-assessments. They're always really hard because you don't know what you don't know, I think. I think there's probably some that are quite nervous. I think there's some that are probably feeling quite confident. But I guess I go back to a couple of conversations that we've had across different organisations is generally people are doing all of this really well anyway. And so it's really just a matter of being able to demonstrate it and maybe tidying up some of the systems that you've got to be able to demonstrate or to be able to kind of just more clearly and articulately kind of give the right information around what the work that you're doing. So I think I do think a lot of organisations have already got it right. It's actually just about how you package that up and make sure you can demonstrate that.
Yeah, okay, great. All right, we're going to run a quick live poll now as well, just to get a bit of feedback, temperature check. The question here is, where do you expect your organisation will feel the biggest pressure 6 months after these standards begin? Is it staffing and resourcing, compliance and audit workload, food and nutrition delivery, balancing consumer expectations, or financial stability? Where do you think that the biggest pressure is going to come in 6 months' time as an outcome from 1 November? So we'll let just a few of these results come through. As they're coming through, it's like compliance is always the one. The compliance and audit workload is definitely strong, with the amount of things that people have got to do. And that sort of is a bit of a flow on from our earlier poll questions as well. So it looks like people believe it will continue on into the coming months as well. Looks like we've got almost everyone through there. So let's just end that poll and share this. So coming through there, we've got very strong 60% believe that compliance and audit workload will still continue to be their biggest pressure in the next 6 months' time as well, followed by 17% with staffing and resourcing, 14% with balancing consumer expectations, 7% with financial stability, and 2% with food and nutrition delivery, which is good to see. So thank you everyone for helping with that. As we move on, we're just going to open up a quick questions. We are running over time. I know a lot of the chat has been opened and the questions have been answered as we've been going. But Tyler, is there anything specific there that you want to?
Yeah, I think the one interesting question was one Susan really, I guess, touched on right at the end there, and that is the delineation between the governance provided by a board and the management of operations, and I guess how an organization defines the line that exists between that. So, do you think boards need to be more involved in operations to ensure policies are followed?
And it's a really interesting debate because I've had it a couple of times recently. Like the accountability requirements and the need for boards, they're actually being asked to be more accountable. So they're actually being asked to know more about the business. So I think there's a natural tendency for boards to want to ask questions. I think they have a right to ask a question. I think it's the way. Firstly, it's the way the questions are asked, but also the way the information is presented by management. I think there's, and also having a conversation about what everyone's role is and what their obligations are and how they're being met. I actually had that chat this morning with another organisation, but that line I think is never straight and it's never solid. I think it does move a little bit depending on the uncertainty. I think the idea is to keep questioning it and to keep checking in, going, okay, we're in an uncertain environment. Yes, we need to have a little bit more information. When do we pull back? I think COVID saw a lot of boards jumping in, asking lots of questions. Not all of them have been able to pull back out of the weeds yet, and that's becoming problematic. So it's just knowing that there is a bit of an ebb and flow and being able to make sure you manage that so that it's answering the right questions and then pulling back at the right time.
Yeah, and certainly not a unique dynamic to this sector at all. It's everywhere.
Anything else,
Ben, yeah, I
Tyler?
think that's all we had time
That's all
for.
right. Yeah, we are running a little bit behind, so we will continue to move on. So it is being recorded. So if you do like to share this to any of your colleagues, a recording will come out post wrap up of the webinar. But just a reminder as well, with inside Mirus here, we've got our Care Minute Manager solution. So if anyone is struggling with the changes with Care Minutes coming, that you've got to keep track of this current quarter, please reach out to the team and speak to us about the Care Minute Manager solution that we can support you with. Also, Care Minute policy review as well, which is again a very, very critical part of managing your care minutes and going forward with the changes in this current quarter where you're tracking those care minutes and making sure that your policies are clear and are matching your care minutes you are documenting down. And also save the date. So flowing on a little bit from what Susan said as well, we're going to do one called From Reform to Reality, what it has the first month taught us. So that continuous improvement loop. So that's a nice segue from item 10 from Susan's presentation there of that checklist of coming back and checking in with everyone and saying, well, what has this first month taught us? So we will be providing this one on Wednesday, the 3rd of December. So please, we welcome you all back to hear from some different providers and hopefully maybe even the department around what's happened through this first month and what have the lessons been learnt so far as we all sort of navigate these changes that are coming in from 1 November. That is a thank you from us. Apologies for being over time, but thank you from everyone here at Mirus, and we welcome you back hopefully in a month's time to see where we're all at in just over 30 days time. Thank you everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.
Bye.